Okay, we are just about ready. Just getting the cat set. They are getting along much better today. I guess day 2 is usually expected to be a little bit better. So we can go ahead and get started with hopefully minimal interruption tonight. So, welcome back to our reading of The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne. This is our 6th day of the book. We are about halfway. We'll pass the 50% mark before the end of the night, I'm sure. So yeah, this one is quite a bit more to it than our last book. There's just the nature of it being more of a semi-fantasy novel at the time was just lends itself to having more to it. And Verne tends to be a little bit wordy. There's a lot going on, and much ado about nothing at the same time. So, it is what it is. But we will get through this, and we will see what the island has in store for our intrepid colonists today. So, let's just go ahead and kick things right off. With Chapter 10 of The Mysterious Island in Part 2 of the book. When Pencroft had once got a plan in his head, he had no peace till it was executed. Now he wished to visit Tabor Island, and as a boat of a certain size was necessary for this voyage, he determined to build one. What wood should he employ, elm or fir, both of which abounded in the island? They decided for the fir, as being easy to work, but which stands water as well as the elm. These details settled, it was agreed that since the fine season would not return before 6 months, Cyrus Harding and Pencroft should work alone at the boat. Gideon Spilett and Herbert were to continue to hunt, and neither Neb nor Master Jup, his assistant, were to leave the domestic duties, which had devolved upon them. Reminder, Jup is the orangutan, let's call him a butler for now, but yeah. Anyway, directly the trees were chosen. They were felled, stripped of their branches, and sawn into planks, as well as sawyers. Sawyers could have been able to do it. A week after, in the recess between the chimneys and the cliff, a dockyard was prepared. A keel 5 and 30 feet long, furnished with a stern post at the stern and a stem at the bows, lay along the sand. Cyrus Harding was not working in the dark at this new trade. He knew as much about shipbuilding as about nearly everything else, and he had at first drawn the model of his ship on paper. Besides, he was ably seconded by Pencroft, who, having worked for several years in a dockyard in Brooklyn, knew the practical part of the trade. It was not until after careful calculation and deep thought that the timbers were laid on the keel. Pencroft, as may be believed, was all eagerness to carry out his new enterprise, and would not leave his work for an instant. A single thing had the honor of drawing him but for one day from his dockyard. This was the second wheat harvest, which was gathered in on the 15th of April. It was as much a success as the first, and yielded the number of grains which had been predicted. 5 bushels, Captain, said Pencroft, after having scrupulously measured his treasure. 5 bushels, replied the engineer, and 130,000 grains a bushel will make 650,000 grains. Well, we will sow them all this time, said the sailor, except a little in reserve. Yes, Pencroft, and if the next crop gives proportionate yield, we shall have 4,000 bushels. And shall we eat bread? We shall eat bread. But we must have a mill. We will make one. Quick aside, I have a sound effect for page turning. Do you guys hear it? I'm not sure whether it comes through loud enough or if I need to adjust the outputs, but anyway, just feel free to chime in chat if it does prop up. The third cornfield was very much larger than the 2 first, and the soil, prepared with extreme care, received the precious seed. That done, Pencroft returned to his work. During this time, Spilett and Herbert hunted in the neighborhood, and they ventured deep into the still unknown parts of the far west, their guns loaded with ball, ready for any dangerous emergency. It was a vast thicket of magnificent trees, crowded together as if pressed for room. The exploration of these dense masses of wood was difficult in the extreme, and the reporter never ventured there without the pocket compass, for the sun scarcely pierced through the thick foliage, and it would have been very difficult for them to retrace their way. It naturally happened that game was more rare in those situations where there was hardly sufficient room to move. 2 or 3 large herbivorous animals were however killed during the last fortnight of April. These were koalas, specimens of which the settlers had already seen to the north of the lake, and which stupidly allowed themselves to be killed among the thick branches of the trees in which they took refuge. Their skins were brought back to Granite House, and there, by the help of sulfuric acid, they were subjected to a sort of tanning process, which rendered them capable of being used. On the 30th of April, the 2 sportsmen were in the depth of the far west, when the reporter, preceding Herbert a few paces, arrived in a sort of clearing, into which the trees more sparsely scattered had permitted a few rays to penetrate. Gideon Spilett was at first surprised at the odor which exhaled from the certain plants with straight stalks, round and branchy, bearing grape-like clusters of flowers, and very small berries. The reporter broke off 1 or 2 of these stalks and returned to the lad, to whom he said, "What can this be, Mr. Spilett?" "Well, Mr. Spilett, what can this be, Herbert?" "Well, Mr. Spilett," said Herbert, "this is a treasure which will secure you Pencroft's gratitude forever." "Is it tobacco?" "Yes, and though it may not be of the first quality, it is none the less tobacco." "Oh, good old Pencroft! Won't he be pleased? But we must not let him smoke it all. He must give us our share." "Ah, an idea occurs to me, Mr. Spilett. Don't let us say anything to Pencroft yet. We will prepare the leaves, and one fine day we will present him with a pipe already filled." "All right, Herbert, and on that day our worthy companion will have nothing left to wish for in this world." The reporter and the lad secured a good store of the precious plant, and then returned to Granite House, where they smuggled it in with as much precaution as if Pencroft had been the most vigilant and severe of custom house officers. Cyrus Harding and Neb were taken into confidence, and the sailors suspected nothing during the whole time. Necessarily somewhat long, which was required in order to dry the small leaves, chop them up, and subject them to a certain torrefaction on hot stones. This took 2 months, but all these manipulations were successfully carried on unknown to Pencroft, for, occupied with the construction of his boat, he only returned to Granite House at the hour of rest. For some days they had observed an enormous animal, 2 or 3 miles out in the open sea, swimming around Lincoln Island. This was a whale of the largest size, which apparently belonged to the southern species, called the Cape whale. "What a lucky chance it would be if we could capture it," cried the sailor. "Ah, if only we had a proper boat and a good harpoon! I would say after the beast, for he would be well worth the trouble of catching." "Well, Pencroft," observed Harding, "I should much like to watch you handling a harpoon." "It would be very interesting. "I am astonished," said the reporter, "to see a whale in this comparatively high latitude." "Why so, Mr. Spilett?" replied Herbert. "We are exactly in that part of the Pacific which English and American whalemen call the whale field, and it is here, between New Zealand and South America, that the whales of the southern hemisphere are met with in the greatest numbers." And Pencroft returned to his work, not without uttering a sigh of regret, for every sailor is a born fisherman, and if the pleasure of fishing is in exact proportion to the size of the animal, one can judge how a whaler feels inside of a whale. And if this had only been for pleasure! But they could not help feeling how valuable such a prize would have been to the colony, for the oil, fat, and bones would have been put to many uses. Now it happened that this whale appeared to have no wish to leave the waters of the island. Therefore, whether from the windows of Granite House or from Prospect Heights, Herbert and Gideon Spilett, when they were not hunting, or Neb, unless presiding over his fires, never left the telescope, but watched all the animal's movements. The cetacean, having entered far into Union Bay, made rapid furrows across it from Mandible Cape to Claw Cape, propelled by its enormously powerful flukes, on which it supported itself, and making its way through the water at the rate little short of 12 knots. Sometimes it also approached so near to the island that it could be clearly distinguished. It was the southern whale, which is completely black, the head being more depressed than that of the northern whale. They could also see it throwing up from its air holes to a great height a cloud of vapor, or of water, for, strange as it may appear, naturalists and whalers are not agreed on this subject. Is it air, or is it water, which is thus driven out? It is generally admitted to be vapor, which, condensing suddenly by contact with the cold air, falls again as rain. However, the presence of this mammifer preoccupied the colonists. It irritated Pencroft especially, as he could think of nothing else while at work. He ended by longing for it, like a child for a thing which it has been denied. At night, he talked about it in his sleep, and certainly, if he had had the means of attacking it, if the sloop had been in a fit state to put to sea, he would not have hesitated to set out in pursuit. But what the colonists could not do for themselves, chance did for them, and on the 3rd of May, shouts from Neb, who had stationed himself at the kitchen window, announced that the whale was stranded on the beach of the island. Herbert and Gideon Spilett, who were just about to set out hunting, left their guns. Pencroft threw down his axe, and Harding and Neb joined their companions. All rushed towards the scene of action. The stranding had taken place on the beach of Flotsam Point, 3 miles from Granite House, and at high tide. It was therefore probable that the cetacean would not be able to extricate itself easily. At any rate, it was best to hasten, so as to cut off its retreat if necessary. They ran with pickaxes and iron-tipped poles in their hands, passed over the Mercy Bridge, descended the right bank of the river along the beach, and in less than 20 minutes the settlers were close to the enormous animal, above which flocks of birds already hovered. "What a monster!" cried Neb, and the exclamation was natural, for it was a southern whale, 80 feet long, a giant of the species, probably not weighing less than 150,000 pounds. In the meanwhile, the monster thus stranded did not move, nor attempt by struggling to regain the water while the tide was still high. It was dead, and a harpoon was sticking out of its left side. "There are whalers in these quarters, then?" said Gideon Spilett directly. "Oh, Mr. Spilett, that doesn't prove anything," replied Pencroft. "Whales have been known to go thousands of miles with a harpoon in the side, and this one might even have been struck in the north of the Atlantic and come to die in the south of the Pacific, and it would be nothing astonishing." Pencroft, having torn the harpoon from the animal's side, read this inscription on it: "Maria Stella, Vineyard." "A vessel from the Vineyard! A ship from my country!" he cried. "The Maria Stella! A fine whaler! 'Pon my word, I know her well. Oh, my friends, a vessel from the Vineyard! A whaler from the Vineyard!" And the sailor, brandishing the harpoon, repeated, not without emotion, the name which he loved so well, the name of his birthplace. But as it could not be expected that the Maria Stella would come to reclaim the animal harpooned by her, they resolved to begin cutting it up before decomposition should commence. The birds, who had watched this rich prey for several days, had determined to take possession of it without delay, and it was necessary to drive them off by firing at them repeatedly. The whale was a female, and a large quantity of milk was taken from it, which, according to the opinion of the naturalist Dieffenbach, might pass for cow's milk, and, indeed, it differs from it neither in taste, color, nor density. Pencroft had formerly served on board a whaling ship, and he could methodically direct the operation of cutting up, a sufficiently disagreeable operation, lasting 3 days, but from which the settlers did not flinch, not even Gideon Spilett, who, as the sailor said, would end by making a real good castaway. The blubber, cut in parallel slices of 2 feet and a half in thickness, then divided into pieces which might weigh about 1,000 pounds each, was melted down in large earthen pots, brought to the spot, for they did not wish to taint the environs of Granite House, and in this fusion it lost nearly a third of its weight. But there was an immense quantity of it. The tongue alone yielded 6,000 pounds of oil, and the lower lip 4,000. Then, besides the fat, which would ensure for a long time a store of stearine and glycerin, there were still the bones, for which a use could doubtless be found. Although there were neither umbrellas nor stays used at Granite House, the upper part of the mouth of the cetacean was, indeed, provided on both sides with 800 horny blades, very elastic, of a fibrous texture, and fringed at the end like great combs, at which the teeth, 6 feet long, served to retain thousands of animalculae, little fish and mollusks, on which the whale fed. The operation finished, to the great satisfaction of the operators, the remains of the animal were left to the birds, who would soon make every vestige of it disappear, and their usual daily occupations were resumed by the inmates of Granite House. However, before returning to the dockyard, Cyrus Harding conceived the idea of fabricating certain machines, which greatly excited the curiosity of his companions. He took a dozen of the whale's bones, cut them into 6 equal parts, and sharpened their ends. This machine is not my own invention, and it is frequently employed by the Aleutian hunters in Russian America. You see, these bones, my friends, well, when it freezes, I will bend them, and then wet them with water till they are entirely covered with ice, which will keep them bent, and I will strew them on the snow, having previously covered them with fat. Now, what will happen if a hungry animal swallows one of these baits? Why, the heat of his stomach will melt the ice, and the bone, springing straight, will pierce him with its sharp points. Well, I do call that ingenious, said Pencroft. And it will spare the powder and shot, rejoined Cyrus Harding. That will be better than traps, added Neb. In the meanwhile, the boat building progressed, and towards the end of the month, half the planking was completed. It could already be seen that her shape was excellent, and that she would sail well. Pencroft worked with unparalleled ardor, and only a sturdy frame could have borne such fatigue. But his companions were preparing in secret a reward for his labors, and on the 31st of May he was to meet with one of the greatest joys of his life. On that day, after dinner, just as he was about to leave the table, Pencroft felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the hand of Gideon Spilett, who said, "One moment, Master Pencroft, you mustn't sneak off like that. You've forgotten your dessert." "Thank you, Mr. Spilett," replied the sailor. "I am going back to my work." "Well, a cup of coffee, my friend." "Nothing more." "A pipe, then?" Pencroft jumped up, and his great good-natured face grew pale when he saw the reporter presenting him with a ready-filled pipe, and Herbert with a glowing coal. The sailor endeavored to speak, but could not get out a word, so, seizing the pipe, he carried it to his lips. Then, applying the coal, he drew 5 or 6 great whiffs. A fragrant blue cloud soon arose, and from its depths a voice was heard repeating excitedly, "Tobacco! Real tobacco!" "Yes, Pencroft," returned Cyrus Harding, "and a very good tobacco, too." "Oh, divine Providence, sacred author of all things!" cried the sailor. "Nothing more is now wanting to our island." And Pencroft smoked, and smoked, and smoked. "And who made this discovery?" he asked at length. "You, Herbert, no doubt?" "No, Pencroft, it was Mr. Spilett." "Mr. Spilett!" exclaimed the sailor, seizing the reporter and clasping him to his breast with such a squeeze he had never felt anything like it before. "Oh, Pencroft," said Spilett, recovering his breath at last, "a truce for one moment. You must share your gratitude with Herbert, who recognized the plant, with Cyrus, who prepared it, and with Neb, who took a great deal of trouble to keep our secret." "Well, my friends, I will repay you some day," replied the sailor. "Now we are friends for life." And that brings us to the end of chapter 10, wherein the sailor gets a smoke. They really just seem to have everything going for them. A whale beaches themselves on the island, so they've got whalebone and blubber and oil for a lifetime. They find tobacco on the island, which really has a pretty narrow growing range, if I recall correctly. So it all just sort of works. Well, let's carry on with chapter 11. Winter arrived with the month of June, which is the December of the northern zones, and the great business was the making of warm and solid clothing. The musmons in the corral had been stripped of their wool, and this precious textile material was now to be transformed into stuff. Of course, Cyrus Harding, having at his disposal neither carders, combers, polishers, stretchers, twisters, mule jenny, nor self-acting machine to spin the wool, nor loom to weave it, was obliged to proceed in a simpler way, so as to do without spinning and weaving. And indeed, he proposed to make use of the property which the filaments of wool possessed when subjected to a powerful pressure of mixing together, and of manufacturing by this simple process the material called felt. This felt could then be obtained by a simple operation which, if it diminished the flexibility of the stuff, increased its power of retaining heat in proportion. Now the wool furnished by the musmons was composed of very short hairs, and was in a good condition to be felted. The engineer, aided by his companions, including Pencroft, who was once more obliged to leave his boat, commenced the preliminary operations, the subject of which was to rid the wool of that fat and oily substance with which it is impregnated, and which is called grease. This cleaning was done in vats filled with water, which was maintained at the temperature of 70 degrees, and in which the wool was soaked for 24 hours. It was then thoroughly washed in baths of soda, and, when sufficiently dried by pressure, it was in a state to be compressed, that is to say, to produce a solid material, rough, no doubt, and such as would have no value in a manufacturing center of Europe or America, but which would be highly esteemed in the Lincoln Island markets. This sort of material must have been known from the most ancient times, and, in fact, the first woolen stuffs were manufactured by the process which Harding was now about to employ. Where Harding's engineering qualifications now came into play was in the construction of the machine used for pressing the wool, for he knew how to turn ingeniously to profit the mechanical force, hitherto unused, which the waterfall on the beach possessed to move a fulling mill. Nothing could be more rudimentary. The wool was placed in troughs, and upon it fell in turns heavy wooden mallets. Such was the machine in question, and such it had been for centuries until the time when the mallets were replaced by cylinders of compression, and the material was no longer subjected to beating, but to regular rolling. The operation, ably directed by Cyrus Harding, was a complete success. The wool, previously impregnated with a solution of soap, intended on the one hand to facilitate the interlacing, the compression, and the softening of the wool, and on the other to prevent its diminution by the beating, issued from the mill in the shape of thick felt cloth. The roughness with which the staple of wool is naturally filled were so thoroughly entangled and interlaced together that a material was formed equally suitable either for garments or bedclothes. It was certainly neither merino, muslin, cashmere, rep, satin, alpaca, cloth, nor flannel. It was Lincolnian felt, and the Lincoln Island possessed yet another manufacture. The colonists now had warm garments and thick bedclothes, and they could without fear await the approach of the winter of 1866-67. The operation, ably directed by... that's skipped back a paragraph. The severe cold began to be felt around the 20th of June, and to his great regret, Pencroft was obliged to suspend his boat building, which he hoped to finish in time for next spring. The sailor's great idea was to make a voyage of discovery to Tabor Island, though Harding could not approve of a voyage simply for curiosity's sake, for there was evidently nothing to be found on this desert and almost arid rock. A voyage of 150 miles in a comparatively small vessel over unknown seas could not but cause him some anxiety. Suppose that their vessel, once out at sea, should be unable to reach Tabor Island, and could not return to Lincoln Island. What would become of her in the midst of the Pacific, so fruitful of disasters? Harding often talked over this project with Pencroft, and he found him strangely bent upon undertaking this voyage, for which determination he himself could give no sufficient reason. "Now," said the engineer one day to him, "I must observe, my friend, that after having said so much in praise of Lincoln Island, after having spoken so often of the sorrow you would feel if you were obliged to forsake it, you are the first to wish to leave it." "Only to leave it for a few days," replied Pencroft. "Only for a few days, Captain. Time to go and come back, and see what the islet is like." "But it is not nearly as good as Lincoln Island. I know that beforehand." "Then why venture there?" "To know what is going on in Tabor Island." "But nothing is going on there. Nothing could happen there." "Who knows? And if you are caught in a hurricane?" "There is no fear of that in the fine season," replied Pencroft. "But, Captain, as we must provide against everything, I shall ask your permission to take Herbert only with me on this voyage." "Pencroft," replied the engineer, placing his hand on the sailor's shoulder, If any misfortune happens to you or to this lad, whom chance has made our child, do you think we would ever cease to blame ourselves?" "Captain Harding," replied Pencroft, with unshaken confidence, "we shall not cause you that sorrow. Besides, we will speak further of this voyage, when the time comes to make it, and I fancy, when you have seen our tight-rigged little craft, that when you have observed how she behaves at sea, when we sail round our island, for we will do so together, I fancy, I say, that you will no longer hesitate to let me go. I don't conceal from you that your boat will be a masterpiece." "Say our boat, at least, Pencroft," replied the engineer, disarmed for the moment. The conversation ended, thus, to be resumed later on, without convincing either the sailor or the engineer. The first snow fell towards the end of the month of June. The corral had previously been largely supplied with stores, so that daily visits to it were not requisite, but it was decided that more than a week should never be allowed to pass without someone going to it. Traps were again set, and the machines manufactured by Harding were tried. The bent whalebones, imprisoned in a case of ice and covered with a thick outer layer of fat, were placed on the border of the forest at a spot where animals usually passed on their way to the lake. To the engineer's great satisfaction, this invention, copied from Aleutian fishermen, succeeded perfectly. A dozen foxes, a few wild boars, and even a jaguar were taken in this way, the animals being found dead, their stomachs pierced by the unbent bones. An incident here must be related, not only as interesting in itself, but because it was the first attempt made by the colonists to communicate with the rest of mankind. Gideon Spilett had already several times pondered whether to throw into the sea a letter enclosed in a bottle, which currents might perhaps carry to an inhabited coast, or to confide it to pigeons. But how could it be seriously hoped that either pigeons or bottles should cross the distance of 1,200 miles, which separated the island from any inhabited land? It would have been pure folly. But on the 30th of June, the capture was effected, not without difficulty, of an albatross, which a shot from Herbert's gun had slightly wounded in the foot. It was a magnificent bird, measuring 10 feet from wing to wing, which could traverse seas as wide as the Pacific. Herbert would have liked to keep the superb bird, as its wound would soon heal, and he thought he could tame it. But Spilett explained to him that they should not neglect this opportunity of attempting to communicate by this messenger with the lands of the Pacific. For if the albatross had come from some inhabited region, there was no doubt but that it would return there so soon as it was set free. Perhaps in his heart, Gideon Spilett, in whom the journalist sometimes came to the surface, was not sorry to have the opportunity of sending forth, to take its chance, an exciting article relating the adventures of the settlers in Lincoln Island. What a success for the authorized reporter of the New York Herald, and for the number which should contain the article, if it should ever reach the address of its editor, the Honorable James Bennet. Gideon Spilett then wrote out a concise account, which was placed in a strong, waterproof bag, with an earnest request to whoever might find it to forward it to the office of the New York Herald. This little bag was fastened to the neck of the albatross, and not to its foot, for these birds are in the habit of resting on the surface of the sea. Then liberty was given to this swift courier of the air, and it was not without some emotion that the colonists watched it disappear in the misty west. "Where is he going to?" asked Pencroft. "Towards New Zealand," replied Herbert. "A good voyage to you," shouted the sailor, who himself did not expect any great result from this mode of correspondence. With the winter, work had been resumed in the interior of Granite House, mending clothes and different occupations, among others making the sails for their vessel, which were cut from the inexhaustible balloon case. During the month of July, the cold was intense, but there was no lack of either wood or coal. Cyrus Harding had established a second fireplace in the dining room, and there the long winter evenings were spent, talking while they worked, reading when the hands remained idle. The time passed with profit to all. It was real enjoyment to the settlers when in their room, well lighted with candles, well warmed with coal, after a good dinner, elderberry coffee smoking in the cups, the pipes giving forth an odoriferous smoke, they could hear the storm howling without. Their comfort would have been complete, if complete comfort could ever exist for those who are far from their fellow creatures, and without any means of communication with them. They often talked of their country, of the friends whom they had left, of the grandeur of the American Republic, whose influence could not but increase. And Cyrus Harding, who had been much mixed up with the affairs of the Union, greatly interested his auditors by his recital, his views, and his prognostics. It chanced one day that Spilett was led to say, But now, my dear Cyrus, all this industrial and commercial movement to which you predict a continual advance, does it not run the danger of being sooner or later completely stopped? Stopped? And by what? By the want of coal, which may justly be called the most precious of minerals. Yes, the most precious indeed, replied the engineer, and it would seem that nature wished to prove that it was so by making the diamond, which is simply pure carbon crystallized. You don't mean to say, Captain, interrupted Pencroft, that we burn diamonds in our stoves in the shape of coal? No, my friend, replied Harding. However, resumed Gideon Spilett, you do not deny that some day the coal will be entirely consumed. Oh, the veins of coal are still considerable, and the 100,000 miners who annually extract from them 100 millions of hundredweights have not nearly exhausted them. With the increasing consumption of coal, replied Gideon Spilett, it can be foreseen that the 100,000 workmen will soon become 200,000, and that the rate of extraction will be doubled. Doubtless, but after the European mines, which will soon be worked more thoroughly with new machines, the American and Australian mines will for a long time yet provide for the consumption in trade. For how long a time? Asked the reporter. For at least 250 or 300 years. That is reassuring for us, but a bad outlook for our great-grandchildren, observed Pencroft. They will discover something else, said Herbert. It is to be hoped so, answered Spilett, for without coal there would be no machinery, and without machinery there would be no railways, no steamers, no manufactories, nothing of that which is indispensable to modern civilization. But what will they find? Asked Pencroft. Can you guess, Captain? Nearly, my friend. And what will they burn instead of coal? Water, replied Harding. Water! Water is fuel for steamers and engines. Water to heat water. Yes, but water decomposed into its primitive elements, replied Cyrus Harding, and decomposed, doubtless, by electricity, which will then have become a powerful and manageable force. For all great discoveries, by some inexplicable laws, appear to agree, and become complete at the same time. Yes, my friends, I believe that water will one day be employed as fuel, that hydrogen and oxygen, which constitute it, used singly or together, will furnish an inexhaustible source of heat and light, of an intensity of which coal is not capable. Some day, the coal rooms of steamers and the tenders of locomotives will, instead of coal, be stored with these two condensed gases, which will burn in the furnaces with enormous calorific power. There is, therefore, nothing to fear. As long as the earth is inhabited, it will supply the wants of its inhabitants, and there will be no want of either light or heat, as long as the productions of the vegetable, mineral, or animal kingdoms do not fail us. I believe, then, that when the deposits of coal are exhausted, we shall heat and warm ourselves with water. Water will be the coal of the future. I should like to see that, observed the sailor. We were born too soon, Pencroft, returned Neb, who only took part in the discussion by these words. However, it was not Neb's speech which interrupted the conversation, but Top's barking, which broke out again with that strange intonation which had before perplexed the engineer. At the same time, Top began to run round the mouth of the well, which opened at the extremity of the interior passage. What can Top be barking in that way for? Asked Pencroft. And Jup be growling like that? In fact, the orang, joining the dog, gave unequivocal signs of agitation, and, singular to say, the two animals appeared more uneasy than angry. It is evident, said Gideon Spilett, that this well is in direct communication with the sea, and that some marine animal comes from time to breathe at the bottom. That's evident, replied the sailor, and there can be no other explanation to give. Quiet there, Top, added Pencroft, turning to the dog. And you, Jup, be off to your room. The ape and the dog were silent. Jup went off to bed, but Top remained in the room and continued to utter low growls at intervals during the rest of the evening. There was no further talk on the subject, but the incident, however, clouded the brow of the engineer. During the remainder of the month of July, there was alternate rain and frost. The temperatures were not so low as during the preceding winter, and its maximum did not exceed 8 degrees Fahrenheit, but although this winter was less cold, it was more troubled by storms and squalls. The sea, besides, often endangered the safety of the chimneys. At times, it almost seemed as if an undercurrent raised these monstrous billows which thundered against the wall of Granite House. When the settlers, leaning from their windows, gazed on the huge watery masses breaking beneath their eyes, they could not but admire the magnificent spectacle of the ocean in its impotent fury. The waves rebounded in dazzling foam, the beach entirely disappearing under the raging flood, and the cliff appearing to emerge from the sea itself, the spray rising to a height of more than 100 feet. During these storms, it was difficult and even dangerous to venture out, owing to the frequently falling trees. However, the colonists never allowed a week to pass without having paid a visit to the corral. Happily, this enclosure, sheltered by the southeastern spur of Mount Franklin, did not greatly suffer from the violence of the hurricanes, which spared its trees, sheds, and palisades. But the poultry yard on Prospect Heights, being directly exposed to the gusts of wind from the east, suffered considerable damage. The pigeon house was twice unroofed, and the paling blown down. All this required to be remade more solidly than before, for, as may be clearly seen, Lincoln Island was situated in one of the most dangerous parts of the Pacific. It really appeared as if it formed the central point of vast cyclones, which beat it perpetually as the whip does the top. Only here it was the top which was motionless, and the whip which moved. During the first week of the month of August, the weather became more moderate, and the atmosphere recovered the calm which it appeared to have lost forever. With the calm, the cold again became intense, and the thermometer fell to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero. On the 3rd of August, an excursion which had been talked of for several days was made into the southeastern part of the island, towards Tadorn Marsh. The hunters were tempted by the aquatic game which took up their winter quarters there. Wild duck, snipe, teal, and grebe abounded there, and it was agreed that a day should be devoted to an expedition against these birds. Not only Gideon Spilett and Herbert, but Pencroft and Neb also took part in the excursion. Cyrus Harding alone, alleging some work as an excuse, did not join them, but remained at Granite House. The hunters proceeded in the direction of Port Balloon, in order to reach the marsh. After having promised to be back by the evening, Top and Jup accompanied them. As soon as they had passed over the Mercy Bridge, the engineer raised it and returned, intending to put into execution a project for the performance of which he wished to be alone. Now, this project was to minutely explore the interior well, the mouth of which was on a level with the passage of Granite House, and which communicated with the sea, since it formerly supplied a way to the waters of the lake. Why did Top so often run round this opening? Why did he utter such strange barks when a sort of uneasiness seemed to draw him towards this well? Why did Jup join Top in a sort of common anxiety? Had this well branches besides the communication with the sea? Did it spread towards other parts of the island? This is what Cyrus Harding wished to know. He had resolved, therefore, to attempt the exploration of the well during the absence of his companions, and an opportunity for doing so had now presented itself. It was easy to descend to the bottom of the well by employing the rope ladder, which had not been used since the establishment of the lift. The engineer drew the ladder to the hole, the diameter of which measured nearly 6 feet, and allowed it to unroll itself after having securely fashioned its upper extremity. Then, having lighted a lantern, taken a revolver, and placed a cutlass in his belt, he began the descent. The sides were everywhere entire, but points of rock jutted out here and there, and by means of these points it would have been quite possible for an active creature to climb to the mouth of the well. The engineer remarked this, but although he carefully examined these points by the light of his lantern, he could find no impression, no fracture, which could give any reason to suppose that they had either recently, or at any former time, been used as a staircase. Cyrus Harding descended deeper, throwing the light of his lantern on all sides. He saw nothing suspicious. When the engineer had reached the last rounds, he came upon the water, which was then perfectly calm. Neither at its level nor in any other part of the well did any passage open, which could lead to the interior of the cliff. The wall, which Harding struck with the hilt of his cutlass, sounded solid. It was compact granite, through which no living being could force a way. To arrive at the bottom of the well, and then climb up to its mouth, it was necessary to pass through the channel under the rocky subsoil of the beach, which placed it in communication with the sea. And this was only possible for marine animals. As to the question of knowing where this channel ended, at what point of the shore, and at what depth beneath the water, it could not be answered. Then Cyrus Harding, having ended his survey, reascended, drew up the ladder, covered the mouth of the well, and returned thoughtfully to the dining room, saying to himself, "I have seen nothing, and yet there is something there." And that brings us to the end of chapter 11. So finally, a bit of a survey of the well in their little cave home. Um, they didn't find anything, not this time, but there's plenty of suspicious things happening around that. Between Top constantly being wary, just worried about it, and now Jupe. It seems all the animals know something is up. Um, so there's something happening there. We'll find out for sure later. And yeah, going back to the discussion that they were talking about earlier with the coal running out, that's very forward thinking of Verne to consider that and bring it forward. Um, we talked about earlier how Verne is like the Star Trek of that time period, thinking forward and imagining what the world might be like in a couple hundred years. But I mean, we're seeing some of that now as the coal is harder and harder to come by and the prices raise. We're looking at different alternatives. The use of hydrogen is not really taking off as a primary fuel source, just because of the cost to generate it in the first place, and it's not really of a need, but it was really telling that Verne thought to look to that as a potential option. He knows and is aware that there's something that, like, there's an impending crisis of the fuel running out, but in what has always seemed like he characterizes everything with great optimism. So yes, there's a problem coming. There's the fuel will run out, but there's the ingenuity of man will overcome it. So it's a nice optimistic take that can be missing in a lot of modern media, where pessimism seems to be the norm. But we'll see. That's kind of touching on real world and current events and everything, and that's not necessarily something bad to approach, but for now, let's just get lost in fantasy. So let's return to Chapter 12. In the evening, the hunters returned, having enjoyed good sport, and being literally loaded with game. Indeed, they had as much as 4 men could possibly carry. Top wore a necklace of teal and Jupe wreaths of snipe round his body. "Here, master," cried Neb, "here's something to employ our time. Preserved and made into pies, we shall have a welcome store. But I must have someone to help me. I count on you, Pencroft." "No, Neb," replied the sailor, "I have the rigging of the vessel to finish and to look after, and you will have to do without me." "And you, Mr. Herbert?" "I must go to the corral tomorrow, Neb," replied the lad. "It will be you then, Mr. Spilett, who will help me?" "To oblige you, Neb, I will," replied the reporter. "But I warn you that if you disclose your recipes to me, I shall publish them." "Whenever you like, Mr. Spilett," replied Neb. "Whenever you like." And so the next day Gideon Spilett became Neb's assistant, and was installed in his culinary laboratory. The engineer had previously made known to him the result of the exploration which had made the day before, and on this point the reporter shared Harding's opinion, that although he found nothing, a secret still remained to be discovered. The frost continued for another week, and the settlers did not leave Granite House unless to look after the poultry yard. The dwelling was filled with appetizing odors, which were emitted from the learned manipulation of Neb and the reporter. But all the results of the chase were not made into preserved provisions, and as the game kept perfectly in the intense cold, wild duck and other fowl were eaten fresh, and declared superior to all other aquatic birds in the world. During this week, Pencroft, aided by Herbert, who handled the sailmaker's needle with much skill, worked with such energy that the sails of the vessel were finished. There was no want of cordage, thanks to the rigging which had been discovered with the case of the balloon. The ropes and cables from the net were all of good quality, and the sailor turned them all to account. To the sails were attached strong bolt ropes, and there still remained enough from which to make the halyards, shrouds, and sheets, etc. The blocks were manufactured by Cyrus Harding, under Pencroft's direction, by means of the turning lathe. It therefore happened that the rigging was entirely prepared before the vessel was finished. Pencroft also manufactured a flag, that flag so dear to every true American, containing the stars and stripes of their glorious Union. The colors for it were supplied from certain plants used in dyeing, and which were very abundant in the island. Only to the 37 stars, representing the 37 states of the Union, which shine on the American flag, the sailor added a 38th, the star of the state of Lincoln, for he considered his island as already united to the great republic. And, said he, it is so already in the heart, if not indeed. Yep, only 37 back then. In the meantime, the flag was hoisted at the central window of Granite House, and the settlers saluted it with 3 cheers. The cold season was now almost at an end, and it appeared as if this second winter was to pass without any unusual occurrence, when on the night of the 11th of August, the plateau of Prospect Heights was menaced with complete destruction. After a busy day, the colonists were sleeping soundly, when, towards 4 o'clock in the morning, they were suddenly awakened by Top's barking. The dog was not this time barking near the mouth of the well, but at the threshold of the door, at which he was scratching as if he wanted to burst it open. Jupe was also uttering piercing cries. "Hello, Top!" cried Neb, who was the first awake, but the dog continued to bark, more furiously than ever. "What's the matter now?" asked Harding. And all dressing in haste rushed to the windows, which they opened. Beneath their eyes was spread a sheet of snow, which looked gray in the dim light. The settlers could see nothing, but they heard a singular yelping noise away in the darkness. It was evident that the beach had been invaded by a number of animals which could not be seen. "What are they?" cried Pencroft. "Wolves, jaguars, or apes?" "They have nearly reached the plateau," said the reporter. "And our poultry yard!" exclaimed Herbert. "And our garden!" "Where can they have crossed?" "They must have crossed the bridge on the shore," replied the engineer, "which one of us must have forgotten to close." "True," said Spilett. "I remember having left it open." "A fine job you have made of it, Mr. Spilett," cried the sailor. "What is done cannot be undone," replied Cyrus Harding. "We must consult what it will now be best to do." Such were the questions and answers which were rapidly exchanged between Harding and his companions. It was certain that the bridge had been crossed, that the shore had been invaded by animals, and that whatever they might be, they could, by ascending the left bank of the Mercy, reach Prospect Heights. They must, therefore, be advanced against quickly, and fought with if necessary. "But what are these beasts?" was asked a second time, as the yelpings were again heard more loudly than before. These yelps made Herbert start, and he remembered having heard them before during his first visit to the sources of the Red Creek. "They are Colpeo foxes!" he exclaimed. "Forward!" shouted the sailor. And all arming themselves with hatchets, carbines, and revolvers, threw themselves into the lift and soon set foot on the shore. Colpeos are dangerous animals when in great numbers and irritated by hunger. Nevertheless, the colonists did not hesitate to throw themselves into the midst of the troop, and their first shots, vividly lighting up the darkness, made the assailants draw back. The chief thing was to hinder these plunderers from reaching the plateau, for the garden and the poultry yard would have been at their mercy, and immense, perhaps irreparable mischief would inevitably be the result, especially with regard to the cornfield. But as the invasion of the plateau could only be made by the left flank of the Mercy, it was sufficient to oppose the Colpeos on the narrow bank between the river and the cliff of granite. This was plain to all, and by Cyrus Harding's orders, they reached the spot indicated by him. While the Colpeos rushed fiercely through the gloom, Harding, Gideon Spilett, Herbert, Pencroft, and Neb posted themselves in an impregnable line. Top, his formidable jaws open, preceded the colonists, and he was followed by Jup, armed with a knotty cudgel, which he brandished like a club. The night was extremely dark. It was only by the flashes of the revolvers as each person fired that they could see their assailants, who were at least 100 in number, and whose eyes were glowing like hot coals. "They must not pass!" shouted Pencroft. "They shall not pass!" returned the engineer. But if they did not pass, it was not for want of having attempted it. Those in the rear pushed on the foremost assailants, and it was an incessant struggle with revolvers and hatchets. Several Colpeos already lay dead on the ground, but their number did not appear to diminish, and it might have been supposed that reinforcements were continually arriving over the bridge. The colonists were soon obliged to fight at close quarters, not without receiving some wounds, though happily very slight ones. Herbert had, with a shot from his revolver, rescued Neb, on whose back a Colpeo had sprung like a tiger cat. Top fought with actual fury, flying at the throats of the foxes and strangling them instantaneously. Jup wielded his weapon valiantly, and it was in vain that they endeavored to keep him in the rear. Endowed, doubtless, with sight which enabled him to pierce the obscurity, he was always in the thick of the fighting, uttering from time to time a sharp hissing sound, which was with him the sign of great rejoicing. At one moment he advanced so far that by the light from a revolver he was seen surrounded by 5 or 6 large colpeos, with whom he was coping with great coolness. However, the struggle was ended at last, and victory was on the side of the settlers, but not until they had fought for 2 long hours. The first signs of the approach of day doubtless determined the retreat of their assailants, who scampered away towards the north, passing over the bridge, which Neb ran immediately to raise. When day had sufficiently lighted up the field of battle, the settlers counted as many as 50 dead bodies scattered about on the shore. "And Jupe!" cried Pencroft. "Where is Jupe?" Jupe had disappeared. His friend Neb called him, and for the first time Jupe did not reply to his friend's call. Everyone set out in search of Jupe, trembling lest he should be found among the slain, and they cleared the place of the bodies, which stained the snow with their blood. Jupe was found in the midst of a heap of colpeos, whose broken jaws and crushed bodies showed that they had to do with the terrible club of the intrepid animal. Poor Jupe still held in his hand the stump of his broken cudgel, but deprived of his weapon, he had been overpowered by numbers, and his chest was covered with severe wounds. "He is living!" cried Neb, who was bending over him. "And we will save him," replied the sailor. "We will nurse him as if he was one of ourselves." It appeared as if Jupe understood, for he leaned his head on Pencroft's shoulder as if to thank him. The sailor was wounded himself, but his wound was insignificant, as were those of his companions, for thanks to their firearms, they had been almost able to keep their assailants at a distance. It was therefore only the orang whose condition was serious. Jupe, carried by Neb and Pencroft, was placed in the lift, and only a slight moan now and then escaped his lips. He was gently drawn up to Granite House. Then he was laid on a mattress taken from one of the beds, and his wounds were bathed with the greatest care. It did not appear that any vital part had been reached, but Jupe was very weak from loss of blood, and had a high fever soon set in after his wounds had been dressed. He was laid down, strict diet was imposed, just like a real person, as Neb said, and they made him swallow several cups of cooling drink, for which the ingredients were supplied from the vegetable medicine chest of Granite House. Jupe was at first restless, but his breathing gradually became more regular, and he was left sleeping quietly. From time to time, Top, walking on tiptoe, as one might say, came to visit his friend, and seemed to approve of all the care that had been taken of him. One of Jupe's hands hung over the side of the bed, and Top licked it with a sympathizing air. They employed the day in interring the dead, who were dragged to the forest of the far west, and there buried deep. This attack, which might have had such serious consequences, was a lesson to the settlers, who from this time never went to bed until one of their number had made sure that all the bridges were raised, and that no invasion was possible. However, Jupe, after having given them serious anxiety for several days, began to recover. His constitution brought him through. The fever gradually subsided, and Gideon Spilett, who was a bit of a doctor, pronounced him quite out of danger. On the 16th of August, Jupe began to eat. Neb made him nice little sweet dishes, which the invalid devoured with great relish. For if he had a pet failing, it was that of being somewhat of a gourmand, and Neb had never done anything to cure him of this fault. What would you have?" said he to Gideon Spilett, who sometimes expostulated with him for spoiling the ape. "Poor Jupe has no other pleasure than that of the palate, and I am only too glad to be able to reward his services in this way." 10 days after taking to his bed, on the 21st of August, Master Jupe arose. His wounds were healed, and it was evident that he would not be long in regaining his usual strength and agility. Like all convalescents, he was tremendously hungry, and the reporter allowed him to eat as much as he liked, for he trusted to that instinct, which is too often wanting in reasonable beings, to keep the orang from any excess. Neb was delighted to see his pupil's appetite returning. "Eat away, my Jupe," said he. YouTube, calm down. All right. "Eat away, my Jupe," said he, "and don't spare anything. You have shed your blood for us, and it is the least I could do to make you strong again." Yeah, a little bit of YouTube shenanigans here. Okay, I think we're okay now. Well, let's carry on. "Eat away, my Jupe," said he, "and don't spare anything. You have shed your blood for us, and it is the least I can do to make you strong again." On the 25th of August, Neb's voice was heard calling to his companions. "Captain, Mr. Spilett, Mr. Herbert, Pencroft, come, come!" The colonists, who were together in the dining room, rose at Neb's call, who was then in Jup's room. "What's the matter?" asked the reporter. "Look," replied Neb, with a shout of laughter, and what did they see? Master Jup, smoking calmly and seriously, sitting cross-legged like a Turk at the entrance to Granite House. "My pipe!" cried Pencroft. "He has taken my pipe! Hello, my honest Jup, I make you a present of it. Smoke away, my old boy, smoke away." And Jup gravely puffed out clouds of smoke, which seemed to give him great satisfaction. Harding did not appear to be much astonished at this incident, and he cited several examples of tame apes, to whom the use of tobacco had become quite familiar. But from this day, Master Jup had a pipe of his own, the sailor's X-pipe, which was hung in his room near his store of tobacco. He filled it himself, lighted it with a glowing coal, and appeared to be the happiest of quadrumana. It may readily be understood that this similarity of tastes of Jup and Pencroft served to tighten the bonds of friendship which already existed between the honest ape and the worthy sailor. "Perhaps he really is a man," said Pencroft sometimes to Neb. "Should you be surprised to hear him beginning to speak to us some day?" "My word, no," replied Neb. "What astonished me is that he hasn't spoken to us before, for now he wants nothing but speech." "It would amuse me all the same," resumed the sailor, "if some fine day he said to me, 'Suppose we change pipes, Pencroft.'" "Yes," replied Neb. "What a pity he was born dumb." Dumb being mute. With the smoke of September, the winter ended, and the works were again eagerly commenced. The building of the vessel advanced rapidly. She was already completely decked over, and all the inside parts of the hull were firmly united with ribs bent by means of steam, which answered all the purposes of a mold. 10 days after taking to his bed... hang on. As there was no want of wood, Pencroft proposed to the engineer to give a double lining to the hull, to ensure the strength of the vessel. Harding, not knowing what the future might have in store for them, approved the sailor's idea of making the craft as strong as possible. The interior and deck of the vessel was entirely finished towards the 15th of September. For caulking the seams they made oakum of dry seaweed, which was hammered in between the planks. Then these seams were covered with boiling tar, which was obtained in great abundance from the pines in the forest. The management of the vessel was very simple. She had from the first been ballasted with heavy blocks of granite walled up in a bed of lime, 12,000 pounds of which they stored away. A deck was placed over this ballast, and the interior was divided into 2 cabins, 2 benches extended along them, and served also as lockers. The foot of the mast supported the partition which separated the 2 cabins, which were reached by 2 hatchways let into the deck. Pencroft had no trouble in finding a tree suitable for the mast. He chose a straight young fir, with no knots, and which he had only to square at the step, and round off at the top. The ironwork of the mast, the rudder, and the hull had been roughly but strongly forged at the chimneys. Lastly, yards, masts, boom, spars, oars, etc., were all furnished by the first week in October, and it was agreed that a trial trip should be taken round the island, so as to ascertain how the vessel would behave at sea, and how far they might depend upon her. During all this time, the necessary works had not been neglected. The corral was enlarged, for the flock of musmons and goats had been increased by a number of young ones, who had to be housed and fed. The colonists had paid visits also to the oyster bed, the warren, the coal and iron mines, and to the till then unexplored districts of the far west forest, which abounded in game. Certain indigenous plants were discovered, and those fit for immediate use contributed to vary the vegetable stores of Granite House. They were of a species of ficoid, some similar to those of the Cape, with eatably fleshy leaves, others bearing seeds containing a sort of flower. On the 10th of October, the vessel was launched. Pencroft was radiant with joy. The operation was perfectly successful. The boat, completely rigged, having been pushed on rollers to the water's edge, was floated by the rising tide, amid the cheers of the colonists, particularly of Pencroft, who showed no modesty on this occasion. Besides, his importance was to last beyond the fishing of the vessel, since, after having built her, he was to command her. The grade of captain was bestowed upon him, and the approbation of all. To supply Captain Pencroft, it was now necessary to give a name to the vessel, and after many propositions had been discussed, the votes were all in favor of the Bonadventure. As soon as the Bonadventure had been lifted by the rising tide, it was seen that she lay evenly in the water and would be easily navigated. However, the trial trip was to be made that very day by an excursion off the coast. The weather was fine, the breeze fresh, and the sea smooth, especially towards the south coast, for the wind was blowing from the northwest. "All hands on board," shouted Pencroft, but breakfast was first necessary, and it was thought best to take provisions on board, in the event of their excursion being prolonged until the evening. Cyrus Harding was equally anxious to try the vessel, the model of which had originated with him, although on the sailor's advice he had altered some parts of it, but he did not share Pencroft's confidence in her, and as the letter had not again spoken of the voyage to Tabor Island, Harding hoped he had given it up. He would have indeed great reluctance in letting 2 or 3 of his companions venture so far in so small a boat, which was not more than 15 tons burden. At 10:30, everybody was on board, even Top and Jup, and Herbert weighed the anchor, which was fast in the sand near the mouth of the Mersey. The sail was hoisted, the Lincolnian flag floated from the masthead, and the Bonadventure, steered by Pencroft, stood out to sea. The wind blowing out of Union Bay she ran before it, and thus showed her owners, much to their satisfaction, that she possessed a remarkably fast pair of heels, according to Pencroft's mode of speaking. After having doubled Flotsam Point and Claw Cape, the captain kept her close hauled, so as to sail along the southern coast of the island. When it was found she sailed admirably within 5 points of the wind. All hands were enchanted. They had a good vessel, which, in case of need, would be of great service to them, and with fine weather and a fresh breeze, the voyage promised to be charming. Pencroft now stood off the shore, 3 or 4 miles across from Port Balloon. The island then appeared in all its extent, and under a new aspect, with the varied panorama of its shore from Claw Cape to Reptile End, the forests in which the dark firs contrasted with the young foliage of other trees and overlooked the whole, and Mount Franklin, whose lofty head was still whitened with snow. "How beautiful it is!" cried Herbert. "Yes, our island is beautiful and good," replied Pencroft. "I love it as I loved my poor mother. It received us poor and destitute, and now what is wanting to us 5 fellows who fell on it from the sky?" "Nothing," replied Neb. "Nothing, Captain." And the 2 brave men gave 3 tremendous cheers in honor of their island. During all this time, Gideon Spilett, leaning against the mast, sketched the panorama which was developed before his eyes. Cyrus Harding gazed on it in silence. "Well, Captain Harding," asked Pencroft, "what do you think of our vessel?" "She appears to behave well," replied the engineer. "Good. And do you think now that she could undertake a voyage of some extent?" "What voyage, Pencroft?" "One to Tabor Island, for instance." "My friend," replied Harding, "I think that in any pressing emergency we need not hesitate to trust ourselves to the Bonadventure, even for a longer voyage. But you know I should see you set off to Tabor Island with great uneasiness, since nothing obliges you to go there." "One likes to know one's neighbors," returned the sailor, who was obstinate in his idea. "Tabor Island is our neighbor, and the only one. Politeness requires us to go, at least to pay a visit." "By Jove," said Spilett, "our friend Pencroft has become very particular about the proprieties all at once." "I am not particular about anything at all," retorted the sailor, who was rather vexed by the engineer's opposition, but who did not wish to cause him anxiety. "Consider, Pencroft," resumed Harding, "you cannot go alone to Tabor Island. 1 companion will be enough for me." "Even so," replied the engineer, "you will risk depriving the colony of Lincoln Island of 2 settlers out of 5. "Out of 6, answered Pencroft. "You forget Jup." "Out of 7, added Neb. "Top is quite worth another." "There is no risk at all in it, Captain," replied Pencroft. "That is possible, Pencroft, but I repeat, it is to expose ourselves uselessly." The obstinate sailor did not reply, and let the conversation drop, quite determined to resume it again. But he did not suspect that an incident would come to his aid and change into an act of humanity that which at first only a doubtful whim. After standing off the shore, the Bonadventure again approached in the direction of Port Balloon. It was important to ascertain the channels between the sandbanks and reefs, that buoys might be laid out, since this little creek was to be the harbor. They were not more than half a mile from the coast, and it was necessary to tack to beat against the wind. The Bonadventure was then going at a very moderate rate, as the breeze, partly intercepted by the high land, scarcely swelled her sails, and the sea, smooth as glass, was only rippled now and again by passing gusts. Herbert had stationed himself in the bows, that he might indicate the course to be followed among the channels, when all at once he shouted, "Luff, Pencroft, luff!" "What's the matter?" replied the sailor. "A rock?" "No, wait," said Herbert. "I don't quite see. Luff, again, right, now!" So saying, Herbert, leaning over the side, plunged his arm into the water, and pulled it out, exclaiming, "A bottle!" He held in his hand a corked bottle, which he had just seized a few cables' length from the shore. Cyrus Harding took the bottle. Without uttering a single word, he drew the cork, and took from it a damp paper, on which were written these words: "Castaway, Tabor Island, 153 degrees west longitude, 37 degrees 11 minutes south latitude." A castaway! Oh, sorry, that's the end of the chapter. End of chapter 12. Bit of a spike in action there, and I got a little ahead of myself there. So as soon as they get a boat, they find a message in a bottle from another castaway on the island they were discussing going to, or not, as may be the case. Huh. Coincidence, coincidence, coincidence. There are so many of them with this island. Well, it is about an hour into a stream, so I think I'm going to take just a few minutes to check on the kitties and refresh my drink. So we'll take a break here at this chapter, and I'll be back in a few minutes. So thanks for hanging with me so far, and we'll be back in just a bit. Okay, we are back. Got one kitten under the desk and one of them sitting above my shoulder on the cat tree. So they are sitting just as comfy as I am. We've updated the drink. It is well past the time for coffee. Yeah, let's just... There we go. Got that updated. And then I believe we are ready to pick right back up. Yeah, the Simba art needs to happen soon. I got the one for Zoe right here. Simba's a little bit different coloring, so I need to put something together for him too. Yeah, we're gonna need two of them. So, and Simba is just an itty bitty baby. So as he gets a little bit bigger, we'll probably have to scale it up a little bit, and we'll see if he gets to be bigger than Zoe or not. But in the meantime, let's just go ahead and start back in, and that gives me some homework to do between making a proper schedule post and a new MS Paint cat. Alright, so that brings us back to Chapter 13. A castaway, exclaimed Pencroft, left on this Tabor Island, not 200 miles from us. Ah, Captain Harding, you won't now oppose my going. No, Pencroft, replied Cyrus Harding, and you shall set out as soon as possible. Tomorrow? Tomorrow! The engineer still held in his hand the paper which he had taken from the bottle. He contemplated it for some instants, then resumed. From this document, my friends, from the way in which it is worded, we may conclude this. First, that the castaway on Tabor Island is a man possessing a considerable knowledge of navigation, since he gives the latitude and longitude of the island exactly as we ourselves found it, and to a second of approximation. Secondly, that he is either English or American, as the document is written in the English language. That is perfectly logical, answered Spilett, and the presence of this castaway explains the arrival of the case on the shores of our island. There must have been a wreck, since there is a castaway. As to the latter, whoever he may be, it is lucky for him that Pencroft thought of building this boat and of trying her this very day, for a day later, and this bottle might have been broken on the rocks. Indeed, said Herbert, it is a fortunate chance that the Bonadventure passed exactly where the bottle was still floating. Does not this appear strange to you? Asked Harding of Pencroft. It appears fortunate, that's all, answered the sailor. Do you see anything extraordinary in it, Captain? The bottle must go somewhere, and why not here as well as anywhere else? Perhaps you are right, Pencroft, replied the engineer. And yet... But, observed Herbert, there's nothing to prove that this bottle has been floating long in the sea. Nothing, replied Gideon Spilett, and the document appears even to have been recently written. What do you think about it, Cyrus? During this conversation, Pencroft had not remained inactive. He had put the vessel about, and the Bonadventure, all sails set, was running rapidly towards Claw Cape. Everyone was thinking of the castaway on Tabor Island. Should they be in time to save him? This was a great event in the life of the colonists. They themselves were but castaways, but it was to be feared that another might not have been so fortunate, and their duty was to go to his succor. Claw Cape was doubled, and about 4 o'clock the Bonadventure dropped her anchor at the mouth of the Mercy. That same evening, the arrangements for the new expedition were made. It appeared best that Pencroft and Herbert, who knew how to work the vessel, should undertake the voyage alone. But setting out the next day, the 10th of October, they would arrive on the 13th, for with the present wind it would not take more than 48 hours to make this passage of 150 miles. One day in the island, 3 or 4 to return. They might hope that before the 17th they would again reach Lincoln Island. The weather was fine, the barometer was rising, the wind appeared settled. Everything was then in favor of these brave men whom an act of humanity was taking far from their island. Thus it had been agreed that Cyrus Harding, Neb, and Gideon Spilett should remain at Granite House. But an objection was raised, and Spilett, who had not forgotten his business as reporter to the New York Herald, having declared that he would go by swimming rather than lose such an opportunity, he was admitted to take part in the voyage. The evening was occupied in transporting on board the Bonadventure articles of bedding, utensils, arms, ammunition, a compass, provisions for a week. This being rapidly done, the colonists ascended to Granite House. The next day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the farewells were said, not without some emotion on both sides, and Pencroft, setting sail, made towards Claw Cape, which had to be doubled in order to proceed to the southwest. The Bonadventure was already a quarter of a mile from the coast, when the passengers perceived on the heights of Granite House 2 men waving their farewells. They were Cyrus Harding and Neb. "Our friends," exclaimed Spilett, "this is our first separation in 15 months." Pencroft, the reporter, and Herbert waved in return, and Granite House soon had disappeared behind the high rocks of the cape. During the first part of the day, the Bonadventure was still in sight of the southern coast of Lincoln Island, which soon appeared just like a green basket, with Mount Franklin rising from the center. The heights, diminished by distance, did not present an appearance likely to tempt vessels to touch there. Reptile End was passed in about an hour, though at a distance of about 10 miles. At this distance, it was no longer possible to distinguish anything on the western coast, which stretched away to the ridges of Mount Franklin, and 3 hours after the last of Lincoln Island sank below the horizon. The Bonadventure behaved capitally. Bounding over the waves, she proceeded rapidly on her course. Pencroft had hoisted the foresail, and steering by the compass, followed a rectilinear direction. From time to time, Herbert relieved him at the helm, and the lad's hand was so firm that the sailor had not a point to find fault with. Gideon Spilett chatted sometimes with one, sometimes with the other. If wanted, he lent a hand with the ropes, and Captain Pencroft was perfectly satisfied with his crew. In the evening, the crescent moon, which would not be in its first quarter until the 16th, appeared in the twilight and soon set again. The night was dark, but starry, and the next day promised to be fine. Pencroft prudently lowered the foresail, not wishing to be caught by a sudden gust while carrying too much canvas. It was perhaps an unnecessary precaution on such a calm night, but Pencroft was a prudent sailor and cannot be blamed for it. The reporters slept part of the night. Pencroft and Herbert took turns for a spell of 2 hours each at the helm. The sailor trusted Herbert as he would himself, and his confidence was justified by the coolness and judgment of the lad. Pencroft gave him his directions as a commander to his steersman, and Herbert never allowed the Bonadventure to swerve even a point. The night passed quickly, as did the day of the 12th of October. A southeasterly direction was strictly maintained. Unless the Bonadventure fell in with some unknown current, she would come exactly within sight of Tabor Island. As to the sea over which the vessel was then sailing, it was absolutely deserted. Now and then, a great albatross or frigate bird passed within gunshot, and Gideon Spilett wondered if it was to one of them that he had confided his last letter addressed to the New York Herald. These birds were the only beings that appeared to frequent this part of the ocean between Tabor and Lincoln Islands. "And yet," observed Herbert, This is the time that whalers usually proceed towards the southern part of the Pacific. Indeed, I do not think there could be a more deserted sea than this. It is not quite so deserted as all that, replied Pencroft. What do you mean? Asked the reporter. We are on it. Do you take our vessel for a wreck and us for porpoises? And Pencroft laughed at his joke. By the evening, according to calculation, it was thought that the Bonadventure had accomplished a distance of 120 miles since her departure from Lincoln Island. That is to say, in 36 hours, which would give her a speed of between 3 and 4 knots. The breeze was very slight, and might soon drop altogether. However, it was hoped that the next morning, by break of day, if the calculation had been correct and the course true, they would sight Tabor Island. Neither Gideon Spilett, Herbert, nor Pencroft slept that night. In the expectation of the next day, they could not but feel some emotion. There was so much uncertainty in their enterprise. Were they near Tabor Island? Was the island still inhabited by the castaway to whose succor they had come? Who was this man? Would not his presence disturb the little colony till then so united? Besides, would he be content to exchange his prison for another? All these questions, which would no doubt be answered the next day, kept them in suspense. And at the dawn of day, they all fixed their gazes on the western horizon. "Land!" shouted Pencroft at 6 o'clock in the morning. And it was impossible that Pencroft should be mistaken. It was evident that land was there. Imagine the joy of the little crew of the Bonadventure. In a few hours they would land on the beach of the island. The low coast of Tabor Island, scarcely emerging from the sea, was not more than 15 miles distant. The head of the Bonadventure, which was a little to the south of the island, was set directly towards it, and as the sun mounted in the east, its rays fell upon one or two headlands. "This is a much less important isle than Lincoln Island," observed Herbert, "and is probably due, like ours, to some submarine convulsion." At 11 o'clock, the Bonadventure was not more than 2 miles off, and Pencroft, while looking for a suitable place at which to land, proceeded very cautiously through the unknown waters. The whole of the island could now be surveyed, and on it could be seen groups of gum and other large trees, of the same species as those growing on Lincoln Island. But the astonishing thing was that no smoke arose to show that the island was inhabited. No signal whatsoever appeared on the shore. And yet the document was clear enough. There was a castaway, and this castaway should have been on the watch. In the meanwhile, the Bonadventure entered the winding channels among the reefs, and Pencroft observed every turn with extreme care. He had put Herbert at the helm, posting himself in the bows, inspecting the water, while he held the halyard in his hand, ready to lower the sail at a moment's notice. Gideon Spilett, with his glass, eagerly scanned the shore, though without perceiving anything. However, at 12 o'clock, the keel of the Bonadventure grated on the bottom, the anchor was let go, the sails furled, and the crew of the little vessel landed. There was no reason to doubt that this was Tabor Island, since, according to the most recent charts, there was no island in this part of the Pacific Ocean between New Zealand and the American coast. The vessel was securely moored, so that there should be no danger of her being carried away by the receding tide. Then, Pencroft and his companions, well armed, ascended the shore, so as to gain an elevation of about 250 or 300 feet, which rose at a distance of half a mile. "From the summit of that hill," said Spilett, "we can no doubt obtain a complete view of the island, which will greatly facilitate our search." "So as to do here," replied Herbert, "that which Captain Harding did the very first thing on Lincoln Island, by climbing Mount Franklin." "Exactly so," answered the reporter, "and it is the best plan." While thus talking, the explorers had advanced along a clearing which terminated at the foot of the hill. Flocks of rock pigeons and sea swallows, similar to those of Lincoln Island, fluttered around them. Under the woods, which skirted the glade on the left, they could hear the bushes rustling and see the grass waving, which indicated the presence of timid animals, but still nothing to show that the island was inhabited. Arrived at the foot of the hill, Pencroft, Spilett, and Herbert climbed it in a few minutes, and gazed anxiously round the horizon. They were on an islet, which did not measure more than 6 miles in circumference, its shape not much bordered by capes or promontories, bays or creeks, being a lengthened oval. All around, the lonely sea extended to the limits of the horizon. No land, nor even a sail, was in sight. This woody islet did not offer the varied aspects of Lincoln Island, arid and wild on one part, but fertile and rich on the other. On the contrary, this was a uniform mass of verdure, out of which rose 2 or 3 hills of no great height. Obliquely to the oval of the island ran a stream through a wide meadow falling into the sea on the west by a narrow mouth. "The domain is limited," said Herbert. "Yes," rejoined Pencroft, "it would have been too small for us." "And moreover," said the reporter, "it appears to be uninhabited." "Indeed," answered Herbert, "nothing here betrays the presence of man." "Let us go down," said Pencroft, "and search." The sailor and his 2 companions returned to the shore, to the place where they had left the Bonadventure. They had decided to make the tour of the island on foot, before exploring the interior, so that not a spot should escape their investigations. The beach was easy to follow, and only in some places was their way barred by large rocks, which, however, they easily passed round. The explorers proceeded towards the south, disturbing numerous flocks of seabirds and herds of seals, which threw themselves into the sea as soon as they saw the strangers at a distance. "Those beasts yonder," observed the reporter, "do not see men for the first time. They fear them, therefore they must know them." An hour after their departure, they arrived on the southern point of the islet, terminated by a sharp cape, and proceeded towards the north along the western coast, equally formed by sand and rocks. The background bordered with thick woods. There was not a trace of habitation in any part, not the print of a human foot on the shore of the island, which after 4 hours' walking had been gone completely round. It was, to say the least, very extraordinary, and they were compelled to believe that Tabor Island was not, or was no longer, inhabited. Perhaps, after all, the document was already several months or several years old, and it was possible, in this case, either that the castaway had been enabled to return to his country, or that he had died of misery. Pencroft, Spilett, and Herbert, forming more or less probable conjectures, dined rapidly on board the Bonadventure, so as to be able to continue their excursion until nightfall. This was done at 5 o'clock in the evening, at which hour they entered the wood. Numerous animals fled at their approach, being principally, one might say, only goats and pigs, which were obviously European species. Doubtless some whaler had landed them on the island, where they had rapidly increased. Herbert resolved to catch 1 or 2 living, and take them back to Lincoln Island. It was no longer doubtful that men at some period or other had visited this island, and this became still more evident when paths appeared trodden through the forest, felled trees, and everywhere traces of the hand of man. But the trees were becoming rotten, and had been felled many years ago. The marks of the axe were velveted with moss, and the grass grew long and thick on the paths, so that it was difficult to find them. "But," observed Gideon Spilett, "this not only proves that men have landed on the island, but also that they lived on it for some time. Now, who were these men? How many of them remain?" "The document," said Herbert, "only spoke of 1 castaway." "Well, if he is still on the island," replied Pencroft, "it is impossible but that we shall find him." The exploration was continued. The sailor and his companions naturally followed the route which cut diagonally across the island, and they were thus obliged to follow the stream which flowed towards the sea. If the animals of European origin, if works due to a human hand, showed incontestably that man had already visited the island, several specimens of the vegetable kingdom did not prove it less. In some places, in the midst of clearings, it was evident that the soil had been planted with culinary plants, at probably the same distant period. What, then, was Herbert's joy when he recognized potatoes, chicory, sorrel, carrots, cabbages, and turnips, of which it was sufficient to collect the seed to enrich the soil of Lincoln Island. "Capital! Jolly!" exclaimed Pencroft. "That will suit Neb as well as us. Even if we do not find the castaway, at least our voyage will not have been useless, and God will have rewarded us." "Doubtless," replied Gideon Spilett, "but to see the state in which we find these plantations, it is to be feared that the island has not been inhabited for some time." "Indeed," answered Herbert, "an inhabitant, whoever he was, could not have neglected such an important culture." "Yes," said Pencroft, "the castaway has gone." "We must suppose so." "It must then be admitted that the document is already a distant date?" "Evidently." "And that the bottle only arrived at Lincoln Island, after having floated in the sea for a long time?" "Why not?" returned Pencroft. "But night is coming on," added he, "and I think that it will be best to give up the search for the present. Let us go on board, and tomorrow we will begin again," said the reporter. This was the wisest course, and it was about to be followed when Herbert, pointing to a confused mass among the trees, exclaimed, "A hut!" All three immediately ran towards the dwelling. In the twilight, it was just possible to see that it was built of planks and covered with a thick tarpaulin. The half-closed door was pushed open by Pencroft, who opened with a rapid step. The hut was empty. And that is the end of chapter 13. So yeah, well, there's a lot going on already. The letter in a bottle found the islanders, and they've managed to make their way just in time over to their neighboring island, which just so happened to be what Pencroft was really wanting all along. But then they found at first nothing, and then an empty hut, which shows that there's been someone more recent, but where are they now? With that, let's go ahead and just jump right back into chapter 14, not to leave off on too great a cliffhanger. Pencroft, Herbert, and Gideon Spilett remained silent in the midst of the darkness. Pencroft shouted loudly. No reply was made. The sailor then struck a light and set fire to a twig. This lighted for a minute a small room, which appeared perfectly empty. At the back was a rude fireplace, with a few cold cinders, supporting an armful of dry wood. Pencroft threw the blazing twig on it. The wood crackled and gave forth a bright light. The sailor and his two companions then perceived a disordered bed, of which the damp and yellow coverlets proved that it had not been used for a long time. In the corner of the fireplace were two kettles, covered with rust, and an overthrown pot. A cupboard with a few moldy sailor's clothes. On the table, a tin plate and a Bible, eaten away by damp. In a corner, a few tools, a spade, a pickaxe, two fowling pieces, one of which was broken, on a plank. Forming a shelf, stood a barrel of powder, still untouched, a barrel of shot, and several boxes of caps, all thickly covered with dust, accumulated, perhaps, by many long years. "There is no one here," said the reporter. "No one," replied Pencroft. "It is a long time since this room has been inhabited," observed Herbert. "Yes, a very long time," answered the reporter. "Mr. Spilett," then said Pencroft, "instead of returning on board, I think that it would be well to pass the night in this hut." "You are right, Pencroft," answered Gideon Spilett, "and if the owner returns, well, perhaps he will not be sorry to find the place taken possession of." "He will not return," said the sailor, shaking his head. "You think that he has quitted the island?" asked the reporter. "If he had quitted the island, he would have taken away his weapons and his tools," replied Pencroft. "You know the value which castaways set on such articles as these, the last remains of a wreck." "No, no," repeated the sailor in a tone of conviction. "No, he has not left the island. If he had escaped in a boat made by himself, he would still less have left these indispensable necessary articles. No, he is on the island." "Living?" asked Herbert. "Living or dead. But if he is dead, I suppose he has not buried himself, and so we shall at least find his remains." It was then agreed that the night should be passed in the deserted dwelling, and a store of wood found in a corner was sufficient to warm it. The door closed, Pencroft, Herbert, and Spilett remained there, seated on a bench, talking little but wondering much. They were in a frame of mind to imagine anything or expect anything. They listened eagerly for sounds outside. The door might have opened suddenly, and a man presented himself to them without their being in the least surprised. Notwithstanding all that the hut revealed of abandonment, and they had their hands ready to press the hands of this man, this castaway, this unknown friend, for whom friends were waiting. But no voice was heard. The door did not open. The hours thus passed away. How long the night appeared to the sailor and his companions. Herbert alone slept for 2 hours, for at his age sleep is a necessity. They were all three anxious to continue their exploration of the day before, and to search the most secret recesses of the islet. The inferences deduced by Pencroft were perfectly reasonable, and it was nearly certain that, as the hut was deserted, and the tools, utensils, and weapons were still there, the owner had succumbed. It was agreed, therefore, that they should search for his remains, and give them at least Christian burial. Day dawned. Pencroft and his companions immediately proceeded to survey the dwelling. It had certainly been built in a favorable situation, at the back of a little hill, sheltered by 5 or 6 magnificent gum trees. Before its front and through the trees the axe had prepared a wide clearing, which allowed the view to extend to the sea. Beyond a lawn, surrounded by a wooden fence falling to pieces, was the shore, on the left of which was the mouth of the stream. The hut had been built of planks, and it was easy to see that these planks had been obtained from the hull or deck of a ship. It was probable that a disabled vessel had been cast on the coast of the island, that one at least of the crew had been saved, and that by means of the wreck of this man, having tools at his disposal, had built the dwelling. And this became still more evident when Gideon Spilett, after having walked around the hut, saw on a plank, probably one of those which had formed the armor of the wrecked vessel, these letters, already half effaced. B-R blank T-A-N blank A. Britannia, exclaimed Pencroft, whom the reporter had called. It is a common name for ships, and I could not say if she was English or American. It matters very little, Pencroft. Very little indeed, answered the sailor. And we will save the survivor of her crew, if he is still living, to whatever country he may belong. But before beginning our search again, let us go on board the Bonadventure. A sort of uneasiness had seized Pencroft upon the subject of his vessel. Should the island be inhabited after all, and should someone have taken possession of her? But he shrugged his shoulders at such an unreasonable supposition. At any rate, the sailor was not sorry to go to breakfast on board. The road already trodden was not long, scarcely a mile. They set out on their walk, gazing into the wood and thickets through which goats and pigs fled in hundreds. 20 minutes later, after leaving the hut, Pencroft and his companions reached the western coast of the island, and saw the Bonadventure held fast by her anchor, which was buried deep in the sand. Pencroft could not restrain a sigh of satisfaction. After all, this vessel was his child, and it is the right of fathers to be often uneasy when there is no occasion for it. They returned on board, breakfasted so that it should not be necessary to dine until very late. Then, the repast being ended, the exploration was continued and conducted for the most minute care. Indeed, it was very probable that the only inhabitant of the island had perished. It was therefore more for the traces of a dead than of a living man that Pencroft and his companions searched. But their searches were vain, and during the half of that day they sought to no purpose among the thickets of trees which covered the islet. There was then scarcely any doubt that, if the castaway was dead, no trace of his body now remained, but that some wild beast had probably devoured it to the last bone. We will set off tomorrow at daybreak, said Pencroft to his two companions, as about 2 o'clock they were resting for a few minutes under the shade of a clump of firs. I should think that we might, without scruple, take the utensils which belonged to the castaway, added Herbert. I think so too, returned Gideon Spilett, and these arms and tools will make up the stores of Granite House. The supply of powder and shot is also most important. Yes, replied Pencroft, but we must not forget to capture a couple or two of those pigs, of which Lincoln Island is destitute. Nor to gather those seeds, added Herbert, which will give us all the vegetables of the Old and the New Worlds. Then perhaps it would be best, said the reporter, to remain a day longer on Tabor Island, so as to collect all that may be useful to us. No, Mr. Spilett, answered Pencroft. I will ask you to set off tomorrow at daybreak. The wind seems to me to be likely to shift to the west, and after having had a fair wind for coming, we shall have a fair wind for going back. Then do not let us lose time, said Herbert, rising. We won't waste time, returned Pencroft. You, Herbert, go and gather the seeds, which you know better than we do. While you do that, Mr. Spilett and I will go and have a pig hunt, and even without Top, I hope we shall manage to catch a few. Herbert, accordingly, took the path which led towards the cultivated part of the islet, while the sailor and the reporter entered the forest. Many specimens of the porcine race fled before them, and these animals, which were singularly active, did not appear to be in a humor to allow themselves to be approached. However, after an hour's chase, the hunters had just managed to get hold of a couple lying in the thicket, when cries were heard resounding from the north part of the island. With the cries were mingled terrible yells, in which there was nothing human. Pencroft and Gideon Spilett were at once on their feet, and the pigs, by this movement, began to run away, at the moment when the sailor was getting ready the rope to bind them. That's Herbert's voice, said the reporter. Run! Exclaimed Pencroft. And the sailor and Spilett immediately ran at full speeds towards the spot from whence the cries proceeded. They did well to hasten, for at a turn of the path near a clearing, they saw the lad thrown on the ground, and in the grasp of a savage being, apparently a gigantic ape, who was about to do him some great harm. To rush on this monster, Throw him on the ground in his turn, snatch Herbert from him, and then bind him securely was the work of a minute for Pencroft and Gideon Spilett. The sailor was of Herculean strength, the reporter also very powerful, and in spite of the monster's resistance, he was firmly tied so that he could not even move. "You are not hurt, Herbert?" asked Spilett. "No, no. Oh, if this ape had wounded him!" exclaimed Pencroft. "But he is not an ape," answered Herbert. At these words, Pencroft and Gideon Spilett looked at the singular being who lay on the ground. Indeed, it was not an ape. It was a human being, a man. But what a man! A savage in all the horrible acceptation of the word, and so much the more frightening that he seemed fallen to the lowest degree of brutishness. Shaggy hair, untrimmed beard descending to the chest, the body almost naked except a rag around the waist. Wild eyes, enormous hands with immensely long nails, skin the color of mahogany, feet as hard as if made of horn. Such was the miserable creature who had yet a claim to be called a man. But it might justly be asked if there were yet a soul in this body, or if the brute instinct alone survived in it. "Are you quite sure that this is a man, or that he has ever been one?" said Pencroft to the reporter. "Alas, there is no doubt about it," replied Spilett. "Then this must be the castaway?" asked Herbert. "Yes," replied Gideon Spilett, "but the unfortunate man has no longer anything human about him." The reporter spoke the truth. It was evident that if the castaway had ever been a civilized being, solitude had made him a savage, or worse, perhaps a regular man of the woods. Hoarse sounds issued from his throat between his teeth, which were sharp as the teeth of a wild beast made to tear raw flesh. Memory must have deserted him long before. For a long time also he had forgotten how to use his gun and tools, and he no longer knew how to make a fire. It could be seen that he was active and powerful, but the physical qualities had been developed in him to the injury of the moral qualities. Gideon Spilett spoke to him. He did not appear to understand, or even to hear, and yet, on looking into his eyes, the reporter thought he could see that all reason was not extinguished in him. However, the prisoner did not struggle, nor even attempt to break his bonds. Was he overwhelmed by the presence of men whose fellow he had once been? Had he found in some corner of his brain a fleeting remembrance which recalled to him humanity? If free, would he attempt to fly, or would he remain? They could not tell, but they did not make the experiment, and after gazing attentively at the miserable creature, "Whoever he may be," remarked Gideon Spilett, "whoever he may have been, and whatever he may become, it is our duty to take him with us to Lincoln Island." "Yes, yes," replied Herbert, "and perhaps, with care, we may arouse in him some gleam of intelligence." "The soul does not die," said the reporter, "and it would be a great satisfaction to rescue one of God's creatures from brutishness." Pencroft shook his head doubtfully. "We must try, at any rate," returned the reporter. "Humanity commands us." It was indeed their duty, as Christians and civilized beings. All three felt this, and they knew well that Cyrus Harding would approve of their acting thus. "Shall we leave him bound?" asked the sailor. "Perhaps he would walk if his feet were unfastened." "Let us try," replied Pencroft. The cords which shackled the prisoner's feet were cut off, but his arms remained securely fastened. He got up by himself, but did not manifest any desire to run away. His hard eyes darted a piercing glance at the three men, who walked near him, but nothing denoted that he recollected being their fellow, or at least having been so. A continual hissing sound issued from his lips. His aspect was wild, but he did not attempt to resist. By the reporter's advice, the unfortunate man was taken to the hut. Perhaps the sight of the things that belonged to him would make some impression on him. Perhaps a spark would be sufficient to revive his obscured intellect, to rekindle his dulled soul. The dwelling was not far off. In a few minutes they arrived there, but the prisoner remembered nothing, and appeared that he had lost consciousness of everything. What could they think of the degree of brutishness into which this miserable being had fallen, unless that his imprisonment on the islet dated from a very distant period, and after having arrived there, a rational being, solitude, had reduced him to this condition? The reporter then thought that perhaps the sight of fire would have some effect on him, and in a moment one of those beautiful flames that attract even animals blazed up on the hearth. The sight of the flame seemed at first to fix the attention of the unhappy object, but soon he turned away, and the look of intelligence faded. Evidently there was nothing to be done. for the time at least, but to take him on board the Bonadventure. This was done, and he remained there in Pencroft's charge. Herbert and Spilett remained to finish their work, and some hours after they had come back to the shore, carrying the utensils and guns, a store of vegetables, of seeds, some game, and 2 couple of pigs. All was embarked, and the Bonadventure was ready to weigh anchor and sail with the morning tide. The prisoner had been placed in the fore-cabin, where he remained quiet, silent, apparently deaf and dumb. Pencroft offered him something to eat, but he pushed away the cooked meat that was presented to him, and which doubtless did not suit him. But on the sailor showing him one of the ducks which Herbert had killed, he pounced on it like a wild beast and devoured it greedily. "You think that he will recover his senses?" asked Pencroft. "It is not impossible that our care will have an effect upon him, for it is solitude that has made him what he is, and from this time forward he will be no longer alone." "The poor man must no doubt have been in this state for a long time," said Herbert. "Perhaps," answered Gideon Spilett. "About what age is he?" asked the lad. "It is difficult to say," replied the reporter, "for it is impossible to see his features under the thick beard which covers his face. But he is no longer young, and I suppose he might be about 50. "Have you noticed, Mr. Spilett, how deeply sunk his eyes are?" "Yes, Herbert, but I must add that they are more human than one would expect from his appearance." "However, we shall see," replied Pencroft, "and I am anxious to know what opinion Captain Harding will have of our savage. We went to look for a human creature, and we are bringing back a monster. After all, we did what we could." The night passed, and whether the prisoner slept or not could not be known, but at any rate, although he had been unbound, he did not move. He was like a wild animal, which appears stunned at first by its capture, and becomes wild again afterwards. At daybreak the next morning, the 15th of October, the change of weather predicted by Pencroft occurred. The wind, having shifted to the northwest, favored the return of the Bonadventure, but at the same time it freshened, which might render navigation more difficult. At 5 o'clock in the morning the anchor was weighed. Pencroft took a reef in the mainsail and steered towards the southeast, so as to sail straight for Lincoln Island. The first day of the voyage was not marked by any incident. The prisoner remained quiet in the fore-cabin, and he had been a sailor, it appeared, that the motion of the vessel might produce on him a salutary reaction. Did some recollection of his former calling return to him? However that might be, he remained tranquil, astonished rather than depressed. The next day the wind increased, blowing more from the north, consequently in a less favorable direction for the Bonadventure. Pencroft was soon obliged to sail close-hauled, and without saying anything about it, he began to be uneasy at the state of the sea, which frequently broke over the bows. Certainly, if the wind did not moderate, it would take a longer time to reach Lincoln Island than it had taken to make Tabor Island. Indeed, on the morning of the 17th, the Bonadventure had been 48 hours at sea, and nothing showed that she was near the island. It was impossible, besides, to estimate the distance traversed, or to trust to the reckoning for the direction, as the speed had been very irregular. 24 hours after there was yet no land in sight, the wind was right ahead, and the sea was very heavy. The sails were close reefed, and they tacked frequently. On the 18th, a wave swept completely over the Bonadventure, and if the crew had not taken the precaution of lashing themselves to the deck, they would have been carried away. On this occasion, Pencroft and his companions, who were occupied with loosing themselves, received unexpected aid from the prisoner, who emerged from the hatchway as if his sailor's instinct had suddenly returned, broke a piece out of the bulwarks with a spar, so as to let the water which filled the deck escape. Then, the vessel being clear, he descended to his cabin without having uttered a word. Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert, greatly astonished, let him proceed. Their situation was truly serious, and the sailor had reason to fear that he was lost on the wide sea without any possibility of recovering his course. The night was dark and cold. However, at 11 o'clock the wind fell, the sea went down, and the speed of the vessel, as she labored less, greatly increased. Neither Pencroft, Spilett, nor Herbert thought of taking an hour's sleep. They kept a sharp lookout, for either Lincoln Island could not be far distant, and would be sighted at daybreak, or the Bonadventure, carried away by currents, had drifted so much that it would be impossible to rectify her course. Pencroft, uneasy to the last degree, yet did not despair, for he had a gallant heart, and grasping the tiller, he anxiously endeavored to pierce the darkness which surrounded them. About 2 o'clock in the morning he started forward. "A light! A light!" he shouted. Indeed, a bright light appeared 20 miles in the northeast. Lincoln Island was there, and this fire, evidently lighted by Cyrus Harding, showed them the course to be followed. Pencroft, who was bearing too much to the north, altered his course and steered towards the fire, which burned brightly above the horizon like a star of the first magnitude. That brings us to the end of chapter 14. So they found someone on the island. Whether or not he'll continue to be a savage or as such, it remains to be seen. Can they nurse him back to civility? Can they reconnect him with his human spirit? Or is he too far gone? How long was he alone? Kind of brings to mind, like, Castaway and things like that. Poor man didn't have volleyball to talk to. But yeah, so let's see. It is about 10 till... Let me see how long this next chapter is. Yeah, let's go ahead and try and get one more in. So let's carry on with chapter 15. The next day, the 20th of October, at 7 o'clock in the morning, after a voyage of 4 days, the Bonadventurer gently glided up to the beach at the mouth of the Mersey. Cyrus Harding and Neb, who had become very uneasy at the bad weather and the prolonged absence of their companions, had climbed at daybreak to the plateau of Prospect Heights, and they had at last caught sight of the vessel which had been so long in returning. "God be praised! There they are!" exclaimed Cyrus Harding. As to Neb, in his joy, he began to dance, to twirl around, clapping his hands and shouting, "Oh, my master!" a more touching pantomime than the finest discourse. The engineer's first idea, on counting the people on the deck of the Bonadventure, was that Pencroft had not found the castaway of Tabor Island, or at any rate that the unfortunate man had refused to leave his island and change one prison for another. Indeed, Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert were alone on the deck of the Bonadventure. The moment the vessel touched, the engineer and Neb were waiting on the beach, and before the passengers had time to leap onto the sand, Harding said, "We have been very uneasy at your delay, my friends. Did you meet with any accident?" "No," replied Gideon Spilett. "On the contrary, everything went wonderfully well. We will tell you all about it." "However," returned the engineer, "your search has been unsuccessful, since you are only 3, just as you went." "Excuse me, Captain," replied the sailor. "We are 4. "You have found the castaway?" "Yes." "And you have brought him?" "Yes." "Living?" "Yes." "Where is he? Who is he?" "He is," replied the reporter, "or rather, he was a man." "There, Cyrus, that is all we can tell you." The engineer was then informed of all that had passed during the voyage, and under what conditions the search had been conducted. How the only dwelling in the island had long been abandoned, how at last a castaway had been captured, who appeared to no longer to belong to the human species. "And that's just the point," added Pencroft. "I don't know if we have done right to bring him here." "Certainly you have, Pencroft," replied the engineer quickly. "But the wretched creature has no sense." "That is possible, at present," replied Cyrus Harding. "But only a few months ago, the wretched creature was a man, like you and me. And who knows what will become of the survivor of us after a long solitude of this island? It is a great misfortune to be alone, my friends, and it must be believed that solitude can quickly destroy reason, since you have found this poor creature in such a state." "But, Captain," asked Herbert, "what leads you to think that the brutishness of the unfortunate man began only a few months back?" "Because the document we found had been recently written," answered the engineer, "and the castaway alone can have written it." "Always supposing," observed Gideon Spilett, "that it had not been written by a companion of this man, since dead." "That is impossible, my dear Spilett." "Why so?" asked the reporter. "Because the document would then have spoken of 2 castaways," replied Harding, "and it mentioned only one." Herbert then, in a few words, related the incidents of the voyage, and dwelt on the curious fact of the sort of passing gleam in the prisoner's mind, when, for an instant, in the height of the storm, he had become a sailor. "Well, Herbert," replied the engineer, "you are right to attach great importance to this fact. The unfortunate man cannot be incurable, and despair has made him what he is. But here he will find his fellow men, and since there is still a soul in him, this soul we shall save." The castaway of Tabor Island, to the great pity of the engineer and the great astonishment of Neb, was then brought from the cabin which he occupied in the forepart of the Bonadventure. When once on land, he manifested a wish to run away, but Cyrus Harding, approaching, placed his hand on his shoulder with a gesture full of authority, and looked at him with infinite tenderness. Immediately, the unhappy man, submitting to a superior will, gradually became calm. His eyes fell, his head bent, and he made no more resistance. "Poor fellow," murmured the engineer. Cyrus Harding had attentively observed him. To judge by his appearance, this miserable being had no longer anything human about him, and yet Harding, as had the reporter already, observed in his look an indefinable trace of intelligence. It was decided that the castaway, or rather the stranger, as he was thenceforth termed by his companions, should live in one of the rooms of Granite House, from which, however, he could not escape. He was led there without difficulty, and with careful attention it might perhaps be hoped that some day he would be a companion to the settlers in Lincoln Island. Cyrus Harding, during breakfast, which Neb had hastened to prepare, as the reporter, Herbert, and Pencroft were dying of hunger, heard in detail all the incidents which had marked the voyage of exploration to the islet. He agreed that with his friends on this point, that the stranger must be either English or American, the name Britannia leading them to suppose this, and besides, through the bushy beard and under the shaggy matted hair, the engineer thought he could recognize the characteristic features of the Anglo-Saxon. "But, by the by," said Gideon Spilett, addressing Herbert, "you never told us how you met this savage, and we know nothing except that you would have been strangled if he had not happened to come if we had not happened to come up in time to help you." "Upon my word," answered Herbert, "it is rather difficult to say how it happened. I was, I think, occupied in collecting my plants, when I heard a noise like an avalanche falling from a very tall tree. I scarcely had time to look around. This unfortunate man, who was without doubt concealed in a tree, rushed upon me in less time than I take to tell you about it, and unless Mr. Spilett and Pencroft—" "My boy," said Cyrus Harding, "you ran a great danger, but, perhaps, without that, the poor creature would have still hidden himself from your search, and we should not have had a new companion." "You hope, then, Cyrus, to succeed in reforming the man?" asked the reporter. "Yes," replied the engineer. Breakfast over, Harding and his companions left Granite House and returned to the beach. They there occupied themselves in unloading the Bonadventure, and the engineer, having examined the arms and tools, saw nothing which could help them to establish the identity of the stranger. The capture of pigs made on the islet was looked upon as being very profitable to Lincoln Island, and the animals were led up to the sty, where they soon became at home. The 2 barrels, containing the powder and shot, as well as the box of caps, were very welcome. It was agreed to establish a small powder magazine, either outside Granite House or in the upper cavern, where there would be no fear of explosion. However, the use of pyroxyle was to be continued. For this substance, giving excellent results, there was no reason for substituting ordinary powder. When the unloading of the vessel was completed, "Captain," said Pencroft, "I think it would be prudent to put our Bonadventure in a safe place." "Is she not safe at the mouth of the Mercy?" asked Cyrus Harding. "No, Captain," replied the sailor. "Half of the time she is stranded on the sand, and that works her. She is a famous craft, you see, and she behaved admirably during the squall which struck us on our return. Could she not float in the river?" "No doubt, Captain, she could, but there is no shelter there, and in the east winds I think that the Bonadventure would suffer much from the surf." "Well, where would you put her, Pencroft?" "In Port Balloon," replied the sailor. "That little creek, shut in by rocks, seems to me to be just the harbor we want." "Is that not rather far?" "Pooh! It is not much more than 3 miles from Granite House, and we have a fine straight road to take us there." "Do it then, Pencroft, and take your Bonadventure there," replied the engineer. "And yet I would rather have her under our more immediate protection. When we have time, we must make a little harbor for her." "Famous," replied Pencroft. "A harbor with a lighthouse, a pier, and a dock. Ah, really, with you, Captain, everything becomes easy." "Yes, my brave Pencroft," answered the engineer, "but on condition, however, that you help me, for you do as much as 3 men in all our work." Herbert and the sailor then re-embarked on board the Bonadventure. The anchor was weighed, the sail hoisted, and the wind drove her rapidly towards Claw Cape. 2 hours after, she was reposing on the tranquil waters of Port Balloon. During the first days passed by the stranger in Granite House, had he already given them reason to think that his savage nature was becoming tamed? Did a brighter light burn in the depths of that obscured mind? In short, was the soul returning to the body? Yes, to a certainty, and to such a degree that Cyrus Harding and the reporter wondered if the reason of the unfortunate man had ever been totally extinguished. At first, accustomed to the open air, to the unrestrained liberty which he had enjoyed on Tabor Island, the stranger manifested a sullen fury, and it was feared that he might throw himself onto the beach, out of one of the windows of Granite House. But gradually he became calmer, and more freedom was allowed to his movements. They had reason to hope, and to hope much. Already, forgetting his carnivorous instincts, the stranger accepted a less bestial nourishment than that on which he fed on the islet, and cooked meat did not produce in him the same sentiment of repulsion which he had showed on board the Bonadventure. Cyrus Harding had profited by a moment when he was sleeping, to cut his hair and matted beard, which formed a sort of mane and gave him such a savage aspect. He had also been clothed more suitably, after having got rid of the rag which covered him. The result was that, thanks to these attentions, the stranger resumed a more human appearance, and it even seemed as if his eyes had become milder. Certainly, when formerly lighted up by intelligence, this man's face must have had a sort of beauty. Every day, Harding imposed on himself the task of passing some hours in his company. He came and worked near him, and occupied himself in different things, so as to fix his attention. A spark, indeed, would be sufficient to re-illumine that soul, a recollection crossing that brain to recall reason. That had been seen, during the storm, on board the Bonadventure. The engineer did not neglect either to speak aloud, so as to penetrate, at the same time, by the organs of hearing and sight, the depths of that torpid intelligence. Sometimes one of his companions, sometimes another, sometimes all, joined him. They spoke most often of things belonging to the navy, which must interest a sailor. At times, the stranger gave some slight attention to what was said, and the settlers were soon convinced that he partly understood them. Sometimes the expression of his countenance was deeply sorrowful, a proof that he suffered mentally, for his face could not be mistaken, but he did not speak, although at different times, however, they almost thought that words were about to issue from his lips. At all events, the poor creature was quite quiet and sad. But was not his calm only apparent? Was not his sadness only the result of his seclusion? Nothing could yet be ascertained. Seeing only certain objects, and in a limited space, always in contact with the colonists, to whom he would soon become accustomed, having no desires to satisfy, better fed, better clothed, it was natural that his physical nature should gradually improve. But was he penetrated with the sense of a new life? Or rather, to employ a word which would be exactly applicable to him, was he not becoming tamed, like an animal in company with his master? This was an important question, which Cyrus Harding was anxious to answer, and yet he did not wish to treat his invalid roughly. Would he ever be a convalescent? How the engineer observed him every moment, how he was on the watch for his soul, if one may use the expression, how he was ready to grasp it. The settlers followed with real sympathy all the phases of the cure undertaken by Harding. They aided him also in his work of humanity, and all, except perhaps the incredulous Pencroft, soon shared both his hope and his faith. The calm of the stranger was deep, as has been said, and he even showed a sort of attachment for the engineer, whose influence he evidently felt. Cyrus Harding resolved then to try him, by transporting him to another scene. From that ocean which formerly his eyes had been accustomed to contemplate, to the border of the forest, which might, perhaps, recall those where so many years of his life had been passed. But Gideon Spilett said, "Can we hope that he will not escape, if once set at liberty?" "The experiment must be tried," replied the engineer. "Well," said Pencroft, "when that fellow is outside and feels the fresh air, will he be off as fast as his legs can carry him?" "I do not think so," returned Harding. "Let us try," said Spilett. "We will try," replied the engineer. This was the 30th of October, and consequently the castaway of Tabor Island had been a prisoner in Granite House for 9 days. It was warm, and a bright sun darted its rays on the island. Cyrus Harding and Pencroft went to the room occupied by the stranger, who was found lying near the window and gazing at the sky. "Come, my friend," said the engineer to him. The stranger rose immediately. His eyes were fixed on Cyrus Harding, and he followed him, while the sailor marched behind him, little confident as to the result of the experiment. Arrived at the door, Harding and Pencroft made him take his place in the lift, while Neb, Herbert, and Gideon Spilett waited for them before Granite House. The lift descended, and in a few moments all were united on the beach. The settlers went a short distance from the stranger, so as to leave him at liberty. He then made a few steps toward the sea. and his look brightened with extreme animation, but he did not make the slightest attempt to escape. He was gazing at the little waves which, broken by the islet, rippled on the sand. "This is only the sea," observed Gideon Spilett, "and possibly it does not inspire him with any wish to escape." "Yes," replied Harding, "we must take him to the plateau, on the border of the forest. There the experiment will be more conclusive." "Besides, he could not run away," said Neb, "since the bridge is raised." "Oh," said Pencroft, "that isn't a man to be troubled by a stream like Creek Glycerine. He could cross it directly at a single bound." "We shall soon see," Harding contented himself with replying, his eyes not quitting those of his patient. The latter was then led towards the mouth of the Mercy, and all climbing the left bank of the river reached Prospect Heights. Arrived at the spot on which grew the first beautiful trees of the forest, their foliage slightly agitated by the breeze, the stranger appeared greedily to drink in the penetrating odor which filled the atmosphere, and a long sigh escaped from his chest. The settlers kept behind him, ready to seize him if he made any movement to escape. And, indeed, the poor creature was on the point of springing into the creek, which separated him from the forest, and his legs were bent for an instant, as if for a spring, but almost immediately he stepped back, half sank down, and a large tear fell from his eyes. "Ah!" exclaimed Cyrus Harding, "you have become a man again, for you can weep." And that is the end of chapter 15. So yeah, there's been a lot going on in this most recent session. The boat was started and finished. They wintered over and had no problems over the winter really. They explored the well. They made the voyage out to Tabor Island, found potentially a new comrade, and brought him back. Got some extra pigs. They buffered up their little farm, and they are now in the process of rehabilitating the poor other castaway. So we'll see what is to be seen. This is a gentler cliffhanger than we've stopped off previously, but we are pushing past 2 hours, and I fear that I may not be able to speak for much longer. So we'll go ahead and end here for the night, and we'll leave you wondering for the next session, which should be on Tuesday this week. Thank you again. Thank you for joining me tonight, and this has been our reading of The Mysterious Island. As we get further and further in the book, it seems to be accelerating and more plot happening. We're a little bit past the halfway point at this point, so we probably have another 5, maybe 6 sessions before we get through this one. So we've got a lot to look forward to. So with that, let's go ahead and call this a pleasant evening and wrap things up. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.